Welcome to another episode of Context with me, Dilek Tuna. The United States is urging Ukraine to relinquish control of a dormant gas pipeline that once carried Russian fuel to Europe as part of a broader minerals for aid agreement. Gas transit through this corridor ended on the 1st of January 2025 after Kyiv chose not to renew its 5-year deal with Moscow. While no longer in use for energy exports, the infrastructure remains physically intact and strategically important, especially as Western nations seek to redraw the region's energy map. The proposed deal from Washington links access to Ukraine's critical mineral reserves and key infrastructure to continue economic and military support. US officials argue that controlling this pipeline could serve future energy planning or enhance strategic leverage in Europe. However, Ukrainian leaders have rejected the offer, describing it as a colonial shakedown that compromises sovereignty without offering concrete security guarantees. Kyiv fears the agreement could set a precedent for unequal exchanges, trading long-term national control for short-term assistance. And the pushback reflects broader concerns about becoming overly dependent on foreign powers, even allies, at a time when Ukraine is asserting its independence and planning its post-war recovery. So as talks continue, the outcome may shape not only the fate of this pipeline, but Ukraine's broader geopolitical trajectory. So joining me now to discuss this further is US political analyst Scott Lucas. Scott, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me here.
Now, what strategic interest does the US see in acquiring control of a non-operational pipeline?
Well, I think we need to start off with the fact that this is more of a Donald Trump interest. And Donald Trump and advisors around him, they just want to control resources and make money off of them. It's as simple as that. The context for this pipeline ultimatum, which is what it is really the demand by the Trump administration that in exchange for any type of assistance to Ukraine, that they be able to take Ukraine's rare earth minerals. Now, that was a deal which was on the verge of being completed in February, which would have been a 50-50 split over those rare earth minerals. But of course, that collapsed with the ambush of the Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky by the US Vice President J.D. Vance and then by Donald Trump. And where we are with those rare earth minerals is the United States is now no longer saying, give us a 50-50 split. They're saying we want full control of those rare earth minerals. Now, when they made that offer, or rather ultimatum, that they get full control of the rare earth minerals earlier this month, they added the demand, we want control of this pipeline that you have mentioned. Now, let's explain what this pipeline is. This pipeline carried or was operated by Gazprom, the Russian state company, to move energy from Sudzha in Western Russia across to Ukraine's border with the European Union, with Slovakia. It has been dormant since January, but only since January because Ukraine said, we're not going to keep paying you money for oil and gas if you keep bombing and attacking us. So the pipeline could quickly be reactivated. But as you have pointed out in your introduction, on whose terms is it reactivated? Is it reactivated with Ukraine being sovereign, with Ukraine being in control of the pipeline across its territory, or with the US, or rather the Trump administration, effectively taking it away?
Okay, and could this move undermine Washington's reputation as a reliable partner to Ukraine?
Washington's reputation has already been undermined as a reliable partner to Ukraine. I mean, let's be very honest here, that the Trump administration changed the approach of the Biden administration, which was that, albeit reluctantly at times, albeit perhaps too late at times, the Biden administration did provide essential financial and military aid for resistance to Russia's invasion, and they did so in the form of grants as well as loans to Ukraine. The Trump people, some Trump people effectively came in, like the Vice President J.D. Vance, and said, we want nothing to do with Ukraine. Others in the Trump administration have said, well, we may give some support for Ukraine, but we'll do it on a transactional basis. In other words, it has to be done as part of a business deal in which we get some type of profit, rather than being a collective effort, one in which Europe has been involved to try to maintain Ukraine as an independent country.
Okay, and how does this proposal reflect the current US approach to influence in Eastern Europe?
Well, I think there's a split amongst the Trump administration. I think there are some Trump advisors who still see the United States as needing to be involved in European security, and that's not just Ukraine. It's also states like the Baltic states. It's also states like Poland that are in the front line with Russia. I think Keith Kellogg, the Trump envoy to Ukraine, the National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, possibly Secretary of State Marco Rubio are part of that ongoing interest in European security. I think others are quite happy to walk away from European security and say, look, Europe can take care of itself. We want nothing to do with this. I think the Vice President J.D. Vance is in that camp. I think the key advisor, Stephen Miller, is in that camp. But of course, what complicates this is that you have a President, Donald Trump, who has no coherent idea about security. He simply is operating as a businessman who has the title of president, who's saying, what's in it for me? And that means you have no assurance of U.S. involvement in European security, or even in the security further afield in states like Azerbaijan. In other words, the idea of the U.S. being part of the international order, or supposed international order, which has been that idea since 1945, I don't think that's any longer the case.
And what's Europe's stance as far as the deal stands as it is currently?
Well, I think on the specifics of the deal, I think they support Ukraine in resisting the idea that they just simply hand over resources to the United States. Europe supports the idea of the U.S. being part of this collective effort to continue to maintain Ukraine, especially as we try to get a ceasefire and a halt to the Russia full-scale invasion. But I think that Europe's having to prepare for the fact that if the Trump administration is so erratic and possibly walks away from Ukraine, that the European Union and other states do have to step up their contributions. I think we're seeing the most significant change in the European defense position since 1945. To be honest with you, I think the fact is that Europe, which has been too slow to provide enough resource for its defense, is now going to try to make up for lost time, in large part because the Americans could walk away.
And will they make up for lost time despite Trump?
I think they are to an extent. I think we have to be realistic that no one can completely fill the American capabilities if they choose to walk away. I mean, America has 10 times the defense spending that Germany, which is Europe's largest country in terms of defense expenditure, has. You know, the U.S. dwarfs everyone else, including China, in terms of what it spends on defense. But I think that you have this commitment announced by the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen to find public and private investment of 800 billion euros over the next 5 years. And that's a serious commitment. And I also think, to talk to you in Azerbaijan, I think there'll be an effort by Europe to work with partners outside of Europe, including in your area of the world, to talk about security in a wider sense, given the fact that this Russian threat, including to parts of what used to be the Soviet Union, this is a threat which is very real.
Okay. And to what extent is this about supporting Ukraine versus securing long-term resource access?
Well, it's both. I mean, it's both, because you cannot have a country which is secure unless it has security over its resources. But I think in contrast to what you quite rightly have said is the Trump administration trying to be colonial here and just seize resources? I don't think this is a case of Europe being imperialist and saying, let's grab the oil, let's grab the gas. The fact here is that pipelines are a very important part of infrastructure and security across Europe and Asia. Azerbaijan knows that full well, being one of the key locations of those pipelines. And I think the fact is you have to approach countries like Azerbaijan by saying, we want to work with you in terms of not trying to take your pipelines or control your pipelines, but that you profit from this while contributing to our security. That becomes a win-win relationship rather than someone trying to dominate the other.
And are there concerns that this could set a precedent for conditional aid in future conflicts?
Oh, look, the Trump administration, again, to get back to this, is posing a challenge to the world in which it's operating almost like, the way a mafia boss would. We're going to make you an offer you can't refuse. Russia has already destabilized the world. Again, I think the most serious threat to Europe since 1945 by trying to seize other countries' resources, by trying to seize their territory, effectively trying to conquer Ukraine. So I think the whole idea of international order it's kind of in the mix right now, and it's important that lines be drawn both with Moscow and with Washington.
And how is the colonial shakedown accusation being viewed within US policy circles?
Well, I think the Trump administration people don't care. I mean, I got to be honest with you here. What you witnessed is that when Vladimir Zelensky actually highlighted at that meeting in the White House the stake of Ukraine's future, the stake of its sovereignty, and the fact that Russia could not be trusted in negotiations, you saw the fact that he was treated like someone who had been disrespectful, in the words of the Vice President J.D. Vance. The J.D. Vance, Donald Trump, they simply want to get people to pay tribute to them. Now, there are others, however, who are important. And I think in Congress, for example, who do want to maintain support for Ukraine and who are troubled by the approach that Trump has taken. And that does include some Republicans. So I think we do need to keep our eyes not just on the Trump administration in a narrow sense, but in a wider sense as to whether the U.S. system does not act in this colonial expansionist way, mirroring the way that the Russians have tried to act in the past few years.
And is this still part of a broader shift toward more transactional diplomacy under the current administration?
Donald Trump is, he operates as someone in terms of a transactional basis. I mean, you just have to be honest about this. He doesn't come in terms of what U.S. security interests are. He doesn't come in terms of what the geopolitical interests are. He certainly does not believe in alliances. He believes in what makes me look good and how I profit. We've seen this on another front with the way that he's conducting the tariffs fiasco. So, countries realize this. Countries realize, that they can flatter Trump, they can appeal to his ego, and they can get something out of this. Saudi Arabia has done this for years. I think the UAE has done it for years. China, although it's embroiled in the tariff war with Trump, has done it in the past. I think this is just simply, this is an unprecedented U.S. administration. And as long as Trump is in the White House, this very different approach to international affairs and international security, where everyone else has to be the adults in the room while trying to make him feel good, I think that's going to have to continue.
Okay, I want to talk about the minerals deal again briefly before we get back onto the gas transit. The deal remains elusive as talks between the two sides were held again on Friday. How much do we know about those talks, and has there been any progress on the deal going forward?
No, the talks last Friday went terribly. You had Ukrainian officials that were having their first meeting with the Americans after this effective ultimatum had been issued, when the terms had been changed for full U.S. control of the fund, which comes from the profits of the rare earth minerals. The Americans had added this demand for control of the gas pipeline, and the Ukraine delegation effectively walked away from it. I mean, there just is no way that Ukraine can accept this, because what you're doing is you're trading a Russian invasion for U.S. domination of your key economic resources. Can you imagine any other country in Europe doing this? Can you imagine Azerbaijan doing this? So we're at a stalemate regarding the way that the U.S. and Ukraine are on this deal. What gives Ukraine a little bit of hope, although those negotiations are going badly, is that the Kremlin is simply being so aggressive in rejecting any type of true approach for a ceasefire. In the past 24 hours, we've seen the Russians kill at least 34 people and wound at least 119 with missile strikes. So the Russians not only are not accepting the U.S.-Ukraine proposals for a ceasefire in the Black Sea, on strikes on energy infrastructure, they are just blatantly killing civilians. And as long as the Russians do that, I think Donald Trump will be discomfited. He does want a deal. He does want a photo opportunity that says that he brings peace to the world. And right now, the Kremlin isn't giving him any appearance that they're going to allow him to have that deal. They simply want to continue to try to keep attacking Ukraine.
And Volodymyr Zelensky rightfully says the minerals deal should profit both countries and could be structured in a way that would help modernize Ukraine. So the proposed deal as it stands doesn't provide that. Can Trump actually see Zelensky's side and possibly move a step closer to this understandable request?
Well, I think if not Trump, some U.S. officials did see that side going back to February. I mean, the deal that was on the table on February 28th. Now, a lot of my Ukrainian friends still don't like it. But the fact here is that that deal at least gave Ukraine control of 50% of the profits from the rare earth minerals. And that deal said first and foremost that that joint fund was to be used for Ukraine's recovery and reconstruction rather than repaying the Americans for aid that had been given in the past. So had that deal been signed in February, I think, yes, it would have shown the Trump administration was acknowledging at least some of the Ukrainian concerns. But once J.D. Vance and Donald Trump decided to verbally assault Volodymyr Zelensky, to expel the Ukrainian delegation from the White House and to try to humiliate him, that possibility of a cooperative deal with the Ukraine disappeared. And the Americans have not, at this point, shown an interest in getting back to it.
Okay, now let's go back to the gas transit, Scott. Does Washington envision a new purpose for the pipeline beyond gas transit?
I haven't seen any reference to what they're going to do beyond, the way that the gas pipeline currently operates. But that's a very good question you asked, because of course, even if the U.S. could get control of the gas pipeline, do they effectively then reach out to Gazprom and allow the Russians to resume the transit of gas across Ukraine, making a profit from that gas, effectively lifting the American sanctions that are on Moscow? Or does the U.S. continue to say, look, we will allow someone else to operate that pipeline? And who would it be? What would the U.S. relationship be with the EU, who, of course, are the main recipients of the gas that's transported through that pipeline? I think none of those questions have been addressed. And I have to go back to a fundamental here. I just think certain Trump officials saw something they could seize in Ukraine and make money out of it. And I don't think they've thought about the details beyond the seizure at this point.
And how might key European partners react if the US gains control over regional infrastructure?
I don't think it'll ever happen. But if it did, I think the Europeans will react with concern. I think it would be far different if this pipeline was being operated, let's say, on an international basis, where other countries were working with Ukraine. I think the idea of the Trump administration coming in and saying, we control the gas flows effectively across this, we're the ones who strike the deals, I think that's a threat to Europe's energy security. And that might sound extraordinary, because the default assumption has been a U.S.-European alliance for decades. But I think there is no longer that U.S.-European alliance. And I think the Trump administration's control of economic assets, you cannot assume that it would be used in cooperation with the Europeans or for any type of European good, as opposed to the personal profit of Trump and his associates.
Okay, and is the US here prepared to offer firm security guarantees in exchange, or is this primarily an economic arrangement?
Certainly Ukraine, from the start, has said that any type of American access to its rare earth minerals, let alone the gas pipeline, has to be as part of a wider deal involving security guarantees. But again, that was what led to the bust-up at the end of February, when Volodymyr Zelensky made it clear he wanted those security guarantees. And the Trump administration people not only did not give them to him, J.D. Vance used this as a pretext to try to show Zelensky out of the White House. So far, we've seen no indication that the U.S. ultimatum has those security guarantees in it. So no, at this point, I think you have to say that the idea of a security guarantee is being led by Europe, in particular by the U.S., by the UK, by the French at this point, trying to get these countries to, first of all, do their part for trying to get a ceasefire. And then if that ceasefire is in place, then you get those European troops inside Ukraine. There's no talks of U.S. troops being inside Ukraine. There's no talk at this point of the Trump administration providing new military aid. So no, I think it's something where you hope the Americans at least don't give support to the Kremlin, but you can't count on them as being part of a security guarantee as part of any deal in the near future.
Okay, Scott, thank you so much for joining us today. It was a pleasure talking to you. And that's where we leave it today, a deal that promises aid but demands control, raising tough questions about sovereignty, strategy and the shape of future alliances. As Kyiv weighs its options, the balance between support and self-rule is under the spotlight. I'm Dilek Tuna. Thanks for watching.